Had I known where that evening would take me, I never would have crossed the threshold into that grand ballroom. I would have come up with an excuse, claimed a migraine, or said I had to stay late at work. Anything would have been better than facing what I saw, what I felt when the truth finally confronted me head-on. But I went anyway. Nadine had been adamant about it, insisting it was time I met the people she spent so many hours with. She framed it like something important, like she needed to prove something. The way she said it unsettled me, but I didn't press. I never did. I trusted her. That was the first mistake I made. The second mistake was brushing off the gnawing discomfort I felt the moment we arrived at the hotel. It wasn't the kind of gathering I had expected. Everything about it felt excessive, too posh, too personal. One of those high-end corporate parties where the drinks keep flowing and people forget where to draw the line. I was never one for such scenes, but I played along. I shook hands, exchanged polite smiles, listened to conversations I couldn't care less about, all while watching Nadine move through the crowd with effortless charm. Then I saw him. He stood much too close to her, his laughter too frequent and too easy. And Nadine, she wasn't just being polite. She was engaged, leaning toward him with a warmth I hadn't felt from her in months. Even then, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe I was just exhausted. But as I moved closer, I saw it. The way his hand rested comfortably at the small of her back, and the fact that she didn't flinch. Then came the words, spoken without hesitation, as if rehearsed. "Oh, he's just a good acquaintance. Just a good acquaintance." I stood there, heart thundering in my chest, while my wife smiled at another man like I had become little more than an afterthought. In that moment, it all fell into place. This wasn't something new. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This had history behind it. Everything that hadn't made sense in recent months suddenly became painfully clear. I could have confronted her. I could have shouted, demanded answers, drawn every eye in that room. But I didn't. Instead, I did something completely unexpected, even for myself. I let it all go. The assumptions, the denial, her. I no longer needed explanations or apologies. I just needed to walk away. And so I did, but not without making sure she would remember it. I didn't leave right away. That would have made things too easy for her. Instead, I lingered. I watched closely, memorizing every glance, every movement, every flicker of expression on Nadine's face. I wanted to catch any sign of guilt, a trace of regret. But there was nothing. She was composed, masterful. The room around me buzzed with music, chatter, and the occasional clink of glassware, but I barely heard it. My entire world had narrowed down to two people, my wife and the man she had casually referred to as a mere acquaintance. I studied him. He wasn't conventionally attractive, nor did he have an overpowering charm, but he exuded confidence, a kind of smug assurance that comes from knowing you've already won. I recognized that look. It wasn't the demeanor of a man trying to steal another's wife. It was the posture of someone who already had. Nadine was radiant, but not in the way she used to be when she was with me. This was different. She moved with ease, spoke with lightness, like a weight had been lifted, like she didn't have to pretend anymore. That's when it struck me. She hadn't been pretending with him. She had been pretending with me. I gripped the glass in my hand tightly, knuckles pale from the pressure, forcing my face to remain unreadable. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing a reaction. Not yet. Then the music shifted, turning softer, slower. A cue for couples to step onto the dance floor beneath the soft shimmer of the chandeliers. That's when he reached for her hand. It was a bold move, one that told me everything I needed to know. I waited for Nadine to pull away, to look around nervously, to at least acknowledge that her husband stood mere feet away. But she didn't. She laughed softly, an unguarded, genuine laugh I hadn't heard in years, and let him lead her to the floor. I could have walked out then. I probably should have. But something rooted me to the spot. Maybe it was the bitter need to witness it fully. Maybe it was all those years of affection collapsing in real time. Or maybe I just needed undeniable confirmation. I stood there, watching them dance, not in the stiff, awkward way colleagues might at an event like this. No, this was something else. Something practiced. He knew exactly how to hold her, where to place his hands, how to guide her, so she smiled with a familiarity I hadn't seen in far too long. And then she leaned in, close enough to whisper something in his ear. Close enough that I noticed the subtle tightening of his grip on her waist. Close enough that I felt something break inside of me, something final. I turned and set down my drink, no longer in doubt. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to plead for answers. I had something far more powerful in mind. I was going to do something much worse. I had already made the decision to vanish from her world completely, and she would never even see it coming. I didn't make a dramatic exit. There was no scene, no drink flung across the room, no loud demands for explanations. That would have handed Nadine more attention than she deserved, more weight than I was willing to give her. So instead, I just stood there, motionless, watching her sway in rhythm with him like I was already a memory fading from her life. Perhaps I had been just that for a while, possibly for years. The warning signs had been flashing for ages, those extended evenings at the office, the sudden urge to guard her phone, the subtle way her eyes stopped focusing when I spoke. All of it was right in front of me, yet I had been too blind, or too hopeful, to add it all up. I had rationalized everything. Every brief moment of absence, every minor fib. I told myself she was under pressure, that work had drained her, that she just needed rest. But the truth was simpler and far more painful. She wasn't exhausted, she had just grown weary of me. A strange stillness took hold of me as I drained the last of my champagne and gently placed the empty glass on a waiter's tray as he walked by. Confronting her would have been pointless. I already had the answers I needed. I wasn't about to plead with someone who had emotionally checked out a long time ago. Rather than leaving the event right away, I chose a quieter route. I wove through the bustling crowd toward the bar nestled at the opposite end of the ballroom. From that spot, I had an unobstructed view of the entire scene without drawing attention to myself. That's when something else came into focus, something I hadn't caught before. The people around them, the onlookers, colleagues, acquaintances, even her closer work friends, they were all watching. Not in shock, but in silent acknowledgement. Some seemed amused, others clearly uneasy, but none of them appeared surprised. And with that, it became unmistakably clear, this wasn't new. It had been happening for a while. I had been the only fool left in the dark, the only one naive enough to believe in the illusion of our marriage. I exhaled slowly, my fingertips pressing into the smooth surface of the bar. My pulse echoed faintly in my temples, but outwardly, I stayed calm. Inside, though, my mind spun with questions. If this had been obvious to everyone else, how long had it really been going on? How long had I been playing the role of the oblivious husband? Had it been weeks? Months? Or even longer? I shifted my gaze to the mirror behind the bar, locking eyes with the man reflected back at me. That man wasn't the same one who had entered the room earlier. There was something more distant in his expression now, something resolute. It hit me then. I wasn't going back home with Nadine. Actually, I wasn't returning home at all. Slipping my hand into my pocket, I pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered briefly before I launched the banking app, transferring a large sum into a private account she had no knowledge of. Without missing a beat, I opened my email and drafted a resignation letter. It wasn't only Nadine I was walking away from, it was the life we had built together. The job I had held to support our shared future, the city where our routines had played out day after day, the expectations I had clung to, they were all part of what I was letting go. I wasn't going to plead for space in her life. I wasn't interested in salvaging what had already been abandoned. I was choosing to erase myself from it entirely. By the time she woke up, Nadine would have to face the fact that, maybe for the first time, she had truly lost me. I didn't leave that ballroom defeated. No, that wasn't the version of me I wanted remembered. I stepped out with purpose, with a quiet dignity, as a man in control of his own story. Not as someone just discovering betrayal, but as someone who had accepted the truth and decided to move forward on his own terms. Outside, the air was brisk, brushing against my skin as I loosened my tie and let out a slow breath. The city buzzed around me, cars in the distance, muffled laughter drifting from a nearby bar, the occasional whisper of wind curling between buildings. I paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. There was a strange peace that began to settle over me. I wasn't furious, not in the explosive, vengeance-filled way people might expect. I didn't feel the urge to lash out or find some kind of destructive outlet. What I felt instead was clarity. Nadine wasn't mine anymore. Not really. She had slipped away long ago. Tonight was just the first time I truly saw it for what it was. It was as if my eyes had finally adjusted to the dim reality she had left behind. I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled through my contacts until I reached the one name I could rely on, Theo. We'd been close since college, long before life became complicated with careers and relationships. Theo had a habit of vanishing for months, but no matter what, he always answered when I needed him. I hit call. He picked up after the third ring. His voice was groggy with sleep, But there was no edge of annoyance, just concern. "You better have a good reason for calling me this late, man," he said. "I need a place to crash," I replied, watching my breath cloud in the chilled night air. There was a short silence, then he asked, "Did you finally come to your senses about Nadine?" A soft laugh escaped me as I shook my head. "Yeah, something like that." Another pause followed, then came a slow, heavy sigh. "Yeah, you can stay here for as long as you need. Do you feel like talking about it?" "Not yet." "Yeah, figured," Theo mumbled. "Did you bring anything with you?" I looked down at myself, the same suit and polished dress shoes I'd been wearing earlier. They were all I had. Just me. That bad, huh? I stayed silent. There was no need to answer. Theo's voice shifted, now alert and more awake. "Come over." Without replying, I ended the call and began walking. Not toward the parking garage. Not toward the place we used to call home. I was heading towards something unfamiliar. As I moved through the city streets, everything around me felt more vivid, more intense. I passed a quaint little cafe where Nadine and I had once spent easy Sunday mornings sipping coffee, laughing about nothing important. A few blocks down, I saw the old bookstore where I had found a rare copy of her favorite novel for our anniversary. But I felt nothing. No tug of emotion. No warm memories. Only distance. By the time I reached Theo's apartment, my mind was made up. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It wasn't just a breakup. I was choosing to vanish from the world Nadine and I had constructed. And by the time she'd even notice I was gone, I'd be long out of reach. When I arrived, the night's weight had settled into me like cold steel. It wasn't the kind of exhaustion that came after endless office hours or heated arguments that dragged into the early morning. This was a different fatigue, the kind you feel when the truth finally crashes down on you, revealing that the life you thought you were living had been a lie all along. Theo opened the door before I could knock, already dressed in his usual hoodie and sweatpants, giving me the look only a best friend could, the kind that says, "Yeah, I know it's bad." "Man," he muttered with a shake of his head. "Come in before the neighbors think some rich guy got lost on the wrong floor." As I stepped into his apartment, the familiar scent of stale beer and old novels wrapped around me. His place was just how I remembered, chaotic, cluttered, real. None of it felt fake, which made it the exact opposite of what I had just walked away from. Theo closed the door and crossed his arms. "So you finally went through with it, huh?" I let out a tired sigh, running a hand through my hair. I saw her dancing with him, Theo. Not in a casual way. Not like coworkers or casual friends. It was different. Intimate. Like they had history. Like they had something real going on behind my back. He let out a long whistle, visibly stunned. "And you just left? What was I supposed to do?" I said, the words sharp with disbelief. "Start a fight? Demand she explain everything? Cause a scene?" I gave a dry, humorless chuckle and dropped onto his couch. She would have lied. She's been lying for months. Maybe longer. Tonight, I finally saw it for what it was. Theo walked to the fridge, grabbed a beer, and tossed it to me. "So what happens now?" That was the question that hung heavy in the room. What now? I twisted off the cap but didn't drink. I just stared at it, as if the liquid inside might hold the answer I hadn't figured out yet. "I'm not going back," I said, voice low and certain. "Not to the apartment. Not to that version of my life. I'm done." Theo gave a small nod, like he already knew that's what I would say. "You'll need a plan. Disappearing like this? It's not something you do without thinking it through." But I had already made up my mind. Sitting there, beer in hand, I reached a conclusion. I wasn't going to explain myself to Nadine. There wouldn't be a dramatic goodbye. No yelling. No heart-to-heart. I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. I was going to vanish. Quietly. Cleanly. She'd wake up, half asleep, reaching for me like she always did, and find empty space. No note on the nightstand. No voicemail. No final conversation. She'd check her phone, expecting one of my typical messages saying, "We need to talk tonight." She'd check the joint accounts, our routines, everything that tied us together, and she'd find only silence. Because betrayal doesn't deserve closure. It earns a quiet exit. I took out my phone and began unraveling every connection between us. Bank accounts? I moved my money to a personal one. Insurance? She was no longer listed. Rent? I canceled my share. She could figure out the rest. Every string that tethered me to her world, I cut loose. By the time she opened her eyes the next day, everything might feel normal. But by noon, she'd realized the entire foundation of her life had cracked open without warning. Theo watched without speaking as I worked. When I finally put the phone down, he simply said, "That's cold, man. But I get it. I leaned back on the couch, exhaling. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something different, freedom. When I opened my eyes the next morning, I wasn't in my apartment. The usual sounds of Nadine scrolling through her phone, pretending everything was okay, were gone. There were no fake good mornings or quiet tension. Instead, I woke on Theo's lumpy couch, staring up at a ceiling that didn't belong to me, feeling a kind of lightness I hadn't felt in years. The events of the night before hadn't been a nightmare to forget. They were a moment of clarity I finally embraced. And somewhere across the city, inside that carefully curated apartment we once shared, Nadine was waking up to a kind of emptiness she never saw coming. I could imagine the whole scene vividly. She would instinctively reach for her phone, half asleep, expecting some casual message from me. Something like asking if she wanted coffee or suggesting we talk when she got back. But instead, she'd find her screen blank. No texts, no missed calls, just silence. That's when confusion would creep in. She'd glance at the clock, trying to make sense of the quiet. And then, as she rolled over and noticed I hadn't returned home, the real fear would settle in. She'd sit up, likely already anxious. She'd check my side of the closet, completely empty. Toiletries, gone. Laptop, charger, personal items, all vanished. She'd frantically search for some sign, some explanation, but there wouldn't be anything left behind. That's the sting of real betrayal. It's clean, silent, and untraceable. People like Nadine always expect a confrontation. They're ready for it, armed with apologies, twisted justifications, and manipulative charm. They want to argue because that keeps them in control. But the absence of a fight? That's what truly unsettles them. I glanced at my phone, half expecting a few missed calls. Nothing. Not yet. Nadine still believed she could explain this away, assuming I was just upset and would come around eventually. She had no clue what was really happening. Theo walked into the room, looking exhausted, like someone who had seen more than he should in one night. He stretched, scratched his head, then grabbed a mug from the counter. After a sip, he gave me a look that said he understood everything without asking much. "You doing okay?" he asked. I gave a slight nod. Better than expected. He exhaled slowly. "You sure you don't wanna?" "Nope." He didn't press further. That was one of the things that made Theo who he was. He understood when to step back and let someone handle their own storm. And that's what I was doing, processing, but not in the way someone usually does after a breakup. I wasn't reliving moments or looking for where things went wrong. I wasn't clinging to what-ifs. I was closing the chapter for good. This day wasn't about Nadine anymore. It was about reclaiming myself. My future was no longer tied to her. And as for her, she had a hard lesson ahead. I didn't bother checking my phone that morning. Whatever was waiting, calls, texts, it all felt irrelevant. They were just empty words from someone who had already emotionally let go of me long before I walked out. I didn't care for her apologies or her attempts to twist the truth. I wasn't interested in anything she had to say. So I sat in Theo's kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee that somehow tasted richer than anything I'd had in years. Maybe because it was the first one I drank knowing I was free. Across the table, Theo observed me, arms folded, leaning back. "So what now?" he finally asked. It was a fair question. I had spent years building my life around Nadine, always the reliable one, the fixer, the supporter. I handled the bills, fixed what broke, and stood by her even when I probably shouldn't have. And what did I get in return? She smiled at someone else like I didn't exist. She let me walk into a room where everyone seemed to know something I didn't. I wasn't going to be that man anymore. I took another sip, letting it settle deep inside me. "I disappear," I said calmly. "From her world. From all of it." Theo raised his eyebrows. "You mean completely ghost her?" I nodded. "She's going to wake up and realize she didn't just lose me. She lost everything I ever brought to her life." He gave a low whistle, shaking his head. "That's cold." That actually made me chuckle. "No, it's just fair. People like Nadine always assume they have more time. They think forgiveness is inevitable, that no matter how far they push, they'll never truly lose someone who's always been there. But this time, she won't be getting that ending. By the time she realized what had happened, she'd find my name removed from all our joint accounts. She'd head out for her morning coffee and her card would decline. She'd try calling me, maybe for the first time in ages because she actually needed something, and get nothing but a disconnected tone. Then, maybe, she'd try Theo. But he wouldn't answer either. Because I wasn't just leaving. I was erasing myself completely from her reality. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this silence would haunt her more than any argument ever could. Theo sat back, still watching me carefully, like he was trying to determine whether I had finally lost it. So you're really just walking away? No last word? No explanation? I shook my head. She doesn't deserve it. Because that's the power people like Nadine feed off: drama, reaction, attention. But when the noise is gone, and they're left with just their decisions, that's when the consequences hit hardest. By the time Nadine realized I had vanished, I had already moved on. Not physically, at least, not yet, but mentally, emotionally, in every way that truly counted. I was finished with the version of myself that tolerated too much, ignored red flags, and waited for the respect I should have had all along. I could picture the weight of her regret setting in, her finally understanding the cost of every choice she made. At first, she would have guessed I was still holed up at Theo's place, brooding, probably expecting her to show up with an apology, a fabricated explanation, or some smooth excuse to patch things up. She would have thought I was upset but still within reach. But then she'd call and get nothing. Her message would hang unsent. No read receipts, no replies. Next, being the pragmatic woman she was when situations demanded it, she would have checked the bank account. That's when reality would begin to hit. My name was no longer listed. The irritation she initially felt would shift into a deeper, rising panic. She would likely scroll through our message history, grasping at any detail, any forgotten hint, anything that might show I was still hovering in the background, silently waiting for a proper goodbye. She would open the closet only to be met with emptiness. She'd start pacing the apartment, convincing herself there had to be a way to repair this. But there wasn't. By midday, she would begin dialing our shared friends, the ones she believed I trusted most. Maybe Theo, even though he would ignore her call. Others, too, but no one would have answers. Just silence, missed calls, or confused voices saying they hadn't heard a thing. Then it would finally hit her. For the first time in years, Nadine would be truly alone. I had always been the reliable one, the person she depended on, the quiet strength she never thought would leave. She had crafted her life around the idea that I'd never walk away. But now, that anchor was gone. It no longer mattered whether she ran to the man she had twirled around with that night, or whether she stayed in our apartment, dissecting memories in an endless loop, trying to find the exact point where things slipped away. None of that mattered anymore, because I had already let go. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was finally alive.